All right, everybody. So this is our look at spatial ecology. So this is whole unit is taken from the Morin book, chapter 10, and the Mittelbach, chapter 12 and 13, and it does go in that order. So how I wanted to start this out is by asking a question. Why do we find certain species in a habitat? Okay, you go to a lake and you find a certain suite of species, a certain number of fish there. Okay, now why do we find them there? There's a variety of different answers and way we can go about this, but what I want to look at is the habitat selection model. Okay, and one of the things that we know is that, let's say you have a variety of mobile organisms that can move around very easily. Something like birds, okay, right? Like pretty much any bird can get anywhere, at least when we're thinking about land, right? Let's not think about like an island context or anything. But we know that we find some birds in some places and not in others. So at least with birds, organisms, these birds are exercising selectivity in their location, right? They're choosing whether to go to some places, to avoid others. So we know that there is some sort of habitat selection. Now this lecture is going to be really animal heavy, just because it's hard to think about habitat selection when we're thinking about plants. There are some ways that we can think about that, but they're all like very passive strategies that the plants aren't making like actual decisions about whether to colonize a specific area, just because we know plants don't really work like that. But so when we think about from the largest scale, we should think about, okay, we're thinking about a specific lake. Why do we have a certain suite of fish there? Well, at the grandest scale, we think about the global species pool. Okay, so this doesn't necessarily have to mean all species on the planet. It could, right? It might just be the species you're interested in. So if we're looking at fish, we can think about only a fish. And at the first level, we think about, can the species actually get there? Okay, so we take the global species pool and kind of like filter it down into all the species that can either get there now or historically could have gotten there, right? So if you look at this picture down here, what we've got is all these different watersheds. Okay, so let's say we find largemouth bass in the Mississippi, Missouri drainage basin, right? You actually don't find largemouth bass naturally, at least in west of the Continental Divide. So we might not expect largemouth bass that evolved in the Mississippi, Missouri drainage basin to be over on the west coast. But maybe there was a time, not necessarily not with largemouth bass, but maybe there was a time before the Rocky Mountains existed that a species could have gotten back and forth across these river drainages. So we have to think in deeper time here too, because species last potentially millions of years. So aspects of like mountain range uplift and going away and continental drift, all these things on evolutionary timescales become important when we think about can a species get there, or has a species gotten there sometime in the past. So this dispersal filter then I'm sorry. So one example of this deeper time kind of thing is the northern pike. Okay, the northern pike is Esox lucius, one of the top predators that we find in some of our lakes around here, at least in Wisconsin. But we can actually find it in a whole Arctic distribution, meaning everywhere up in the northern hemisphere above the tropical zones. And the same species, we can find northern pike here, all in North America. It's the same species that we find over in Europe and Asia. And then they've been introduced a lot of other places, but that is the native range of that. So, if we're thinking about, well, what type of fish can get in this lake, we might need to be thinking about, back to the breakup of Pangea, when we had Laurasia, which was, Asia, Europe, and North America all as one big continent. Another example of really widely dispersed species, I should say, is the puma concolor, right? The mountain lion that we have in the western United States and in Florida, right? I'm not actually sure where this cat evolved, whether it was in North America or South America, but it did evolve in one of those places, and then has since dispersed to North and South America. So, when we think then at this huge global species scale, we also need to think about resolution of these maps, right? So, in this thing, not every lake here in this area has northern pike in it. Not every forest in the red area here has a puma in it, right? So, this is like a large-scale map of where we see where the species can exist, but that doesn't necessarily mean, a given lake right here in the middle of Russia, that doesn't mean that actually has northern pike in it, right? And that's at some of the lower level things that we'll see start to take effect. So what the dispersal filter leaves us with is a regional species pool. Basically, the species that got to the specific place that we're looking at, the habitat we're looking at there. Then there's an environmental filter. Can that species actually live there? Can it survive there? Is its fundamental niche present, right? So if we take this idea, we've seen these depictions before, but this frog here needs a certain amount of precipitation to survive. It can't live in super dry environments or super wet environments. So this frog needs some sort of intermediate level. And when we think about that fundamental niche, then, does the specific habitat, is that fundamental niche present in that habitat? So if we go back here, a northern pike needs, let's say, a water that has a specific temperature. It can survive pretty cold temperatures, right? It can survive lakes being frozen, but it's not going to be found way up in the Arctic. So, but even though we find a specific lake, right here in the middle of Asia, then it might not have that fundamental niche. It might not have the set of conditions that pike needs, and that's what we call that environmental filter then. Now, going beyond that, then, we then have the local species pool. Okay, and now this kind of gets in looking at Chapter 10, and for the next little bit, we'll look at Chapter 10 from the Morin book. The environmental filtering then creates a local species pool. Species, basically, that could potentially survive in a given habitat. But beyond that, then, does the habitat have the necessary biota to support it or not interfere with it, at least? Okay, and this is kind of thinking about the realized niche. Okay, does a habitat have a realized niche? So lions can survive lots of places in Africa, right? But if there aren't any other big mammals there, they're not going to be able to survive. They're not going to have any food sources. But beyond just like predation, there's things like competition. Are there superior competitors there that could potentially competitively exclude whatever species we're talking about? Are there predators that would potentially eat all of that individual? Now, we're not, when we're talking about lions, we're talking about that they are the predators, right? So you can think of it from two different ways there. But then, are there mutualisms, right? So lots of plants potentially could survive in a given area, but they would need their pollinators too. So mutualism can play a role in that. One way we can think about then these interaction filters are prey availability. So predators, predators will often choose their location based on whether there are prey there. So, where do you find lions oftentimes? You oftentimes find them around isolated watering holes because the lions themselves know that, the prey need to come to drink water, so they'll just hide in the bushes along the watering hole. And, I think people kind of understand this, right? If you're a hunter, where are you going to go? You're going to put yourself where the deer are if you're deer hunting, right? So I think people kind of, can kind of integrate this when they think about it in a hunting perspective. The thing is, there are a lot of animals that can't choose, right? So marine invertebrates, they're oftentimes pelagic, right? They're planktonic, floating around as larvae, and then they settle out. And they might not be choosing where they're. Let's not talk about them as prey. Let's just think about them as food, right? So a food resource for blue mussels here, the mussels that are commonly eaten across the world. They have a planktonic larva that just gets taken around with the water, and then they eventually settle out onto a rock. And does that rock have the necessary phytoplankton in the water, or does the water around that rock, I should say, have those phytoplankton that can then support it? So there's plenty of organisms that don't necessarily choose their spot, but they just get eliminated where that prey or their food resource is absent. Another way we can think about the interaction filter then is predator avoidance. Okay, so if you're a prey species, you're going to choose a location to minimize, or maybe not completely avoid predation, but at least minimize it. And a perfect example is that classic story of the elk in Yellowstone National Park before and after wolf reintroduction. Before, in the early 1990s and before, when there were no wolves in Yellowstone National Park, all those elk stayed in the riverbeds because that's where the juiciest plants were that grew the fastest and had all the best nutrients, right? They introduced wolves. Where did wolves go? Right to the riparian areas to feed on those elk. What did the elk do then? The elk got out of there. They went up into the forest and didn't want to get eaten. And that's, then we see the riparian vegetation came back. But let's not talk about the vegetation here. Let's talk about that interaction between the wolves and the elk. So now we don't really find that many elk, or at least very rarely, in the riparian areas along those rivers because they know that the wolves are patrolling them. Another clear example, we've talked about this before, is where do you find zooplankton? And where you find zooplankton in a lake is, highly dependent on whether there is zooplanktivorous fish, those fish that are going to be eating those zooplankton. And if there are, they have very different behaviors. They have very different abilities to be there or not, and that can depend on the day, that diurnal migration, where during the day they spend way down deep and up top at night so that they can minimize their exposure to predation. But it's not just predation, it also has to do with competition, where this interaction filter can cause lots of species to avoid competitors. So in the passive sense, what we see is superior. So this is that marine intertidal zone again, where we have different barnacles here. And what the superior competitor do is the blue one, the Balanus here, is going to outcompete the Cathamelis, right? We've read this paper already, and we know that the Cathamelis can be everywhere basically, but it's eliminated by the superior competitor, the Balinus. So that's not that's a passive interaction filter here, but there's also active, right, where organisms themselves, when they see their competitors, they will choose a different location. Now this can be at different scales, right? It can be at very small spaces like we're talking about here, where it's just a couple feet difference, right? But it could also be whole habitats, where an example like cheetahs don't go where lions are. Lions are much better competitors. They somewhat go over after different prey. Obviously, lions will go after bigger prey, but there's still some prey that cheetah go after that lions also go after, so they don't play nicely, and the lions will oftentimes chase away the cheetahs, and the cheetahs will run away from lions. So at bigger spatial scales, there's this competitor avoidance interaction filter. And then with time too. So you might see that think about niche differentiation, where you have maybe a different niche in time where a certain species will exploit a resource as opposed to another one. All right, that's it for now. See y'all later.